Hey there, welcome to another episode of Cartridges and Casings. And today I have on a very special guest, Mr. Zach Wood, and we have transitioned from the Pacific to the European theater of war, sometimes known as the JV theater. I'm kidding. Today is going to be it's on a very historic date in American military history, that being June 6th of 1944, Operation Overlord, more commonly known as D-Day. And Zach has been so gracious to make himself uncomfortable and represent a paratrooper of the 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment on the day that they jumped into history. But yeah, Zach, welcome to the stream, and yeah, just tell the audience who you are real quick, and then we'll get right into it.
All right. Well, I'm Zach Wood. I'm a former high school history teacher. I'm now seeking other adventures just to life circumstances, but still actively and passionately pursuing history on the side. And today in front of you, I'll stand up. That way you guys can get a full representation to an extent on what I can do. I am currently representing a paratrooper of Charlie Company, 1st Battalion, 502nd Parachute Infantry on the date of their rendezvous with destiny. As 82 years ago today, the 502nd was the vanguard for the American paratroopers jumping into Normandy.
Awesome. Made famous, 101st made famous, of course, through Band of Brothers, Saving Private Ryan, Call of Duty, Medal of Honor. Every time they could, 101st led the way in American history, or at least the poor 82nd, which did more combat jumps. But anyways, thankfully you've put together this slideshow, so let's get right into it. So Zach, what is a paratrooper, and what made them special?
Well, going back to World War II, paratroopers are a revolutionary concept for the Second World War. Originally, even thought about and contemplated during World War I, but they actually see their combat taste and testing during the Second World War. The Germans used them expertly in their invasions of Poland, in their invasions of the Netherlands, France, Norway, moving into Crete, and even further operations into the Soviet Union. But by 1941 or so, after Crete, Adolf Hitler gives this order that while they will still keep the German Fallschirmjäger, they will no longer do combat jumps, just to how disastrous in many ways that was. But seeing the success of that, every single army that's participated in the Second World War is going to create paratroopers. For the time period, there are no helicopters to insert troops behind enemy lines. And it's this revolutionary concept of taking men of fit, sound of mind to an extent, I guess I could say, criminals, as some of the Germans and the Japanese contemplated about the paratroopers and Marine parachutists, putting them through a rigorous training regime and training them on how to safely jump out of a plane and land safely and then take the fight to the enemy right behind their back doors. And in many ways, the American paratroopers and Marine parachutists of World War II paved the way for special forces operations going forward with the United States military.
It's got to take an extra kind of person to volunteer to jump out, because nowadays if you join the paratroop, if you join to be airborne, we at least have some history to it. But thinking back in the day, like, what kind of person would do that? So why volunteer to jump out of a perfectly good airplane?
Well, and it's funny you say that. You and I were just talking about Band of Brothers, and for people that have seen it, one of the things I really like about that show is that each episode starts with the veterans themselves of E506 being interviewed on why they did it or the significance of the episode. And in that first episode, I can't remember which veteran it was, but he's like, we're all on this board, and this guy gets up there and says, anybody want to join paratroopers? And they're like, well, what the hell is paratroopers? Well, you jump out of planes, and everybody's like, oh, go to hell with that. And then he pipes up, but you get paid $50 a month for jump. Just that's it. Sign me up. And, when I was teaching, I did this little conversion that, $50 a month a day is nothing. But you go back to 1942, 1943, 44, 45. That's even with inflation, probably in 2026, we're probably pushing an extra $1,000 a month for guys coming out of the Great Depression, especially some of those Midwest families or some of those just general poor families that suffered due to the Depression. That's a lot of money considering how they grew up. And on top of that, outside of the $50 extra a month, you do get to, for a time period, because the Army's going to change that a little bit in 1944, you get to dress differently in public when you're wearing your Class A uniforms. You get to wear these jump boots and you get to blouse them and show off this boot. And, it's really attractive look. And like a lot of guys have mentioned joining the Marines for the dress blues, a lot of soldiers and a lot of Marines went into the paratroopers with the idea of jump boots, blousing that, not knowing exactly what they might get into there. But to be there in the first place, you have to have 20/20 vision. You have to pass the physical fitness test. You have to be a certain weight depending on your height. And then for a significant period of time, you're going to go through a very intensive training schedule that if you weren't perhaps an athlete in high school running track, playing baseball, or even a skilled farmhand just building strength, that it's designed to weed out the weak. The paratroopers only want the best, those that can physically hang in with the physical fitness of it, those that can hang in with the jump and aren't scared of heights, but also those that are willing to, when shit hits the fan, they're not going to quit on the guys next to them, because behind enemy lines, that's all they have.
I actually got to run Currahee a couple of years ago with some of my firefighter friends. And when I listened to the audiobook for Band of Brothers as an adult, and the fitness level that these guys had to have was like absolutely impressive. And I say that as I run ultra marathons, I run marathons for fun, but like I was like, damn, like I hope I could have been. I know it. I can run. I don't have 20/20 vision though, so wouldn't even got a shot. That's was there any sort of waiver for the vision, do we know of, or were they strict on that?
From my understanding, fairly strict on that. Now you will are we good?
Yeah, we're good. I made myself the main screen by accident.
You will have some guys that will have poor vision, but find their ways around passing the vision. Just that intuitiveness of wanting to become a paratrooper, and wanting to perhaps go with friends or even the money, finding ways to finagle it, but pretty strict on that. And for the height, nobody's shorter than 4'11". And when you get shorter than 4'11" during the war, you're really cutting it close to what was classified as 4F, if you were actually eligible to serve in any branch, versus the height there was roughly 6'6". And that's because the inside of a C-47, when you are standing there's only a certain height width. So, if you're 7 foot tall, you're going to be hunched over like this. You could have complications coming out of the aircraft. And what a lot of people might not realize, when you have what I'm wearing here, which is a pretty heavy load, plus what you would consider of a parachute, a leg bag on D-Day that's containing extra ammunition and equipment, your weight is going to double. I roughly weigh about 150 pounds now. You take all this extra shit because I'm going into combat for the first time, that's 300 pounds. If you weigh 200 pounds and you're jumping out of a plane at 350 to 400 pounds, a lot of things can possibly go wrong when we think about that added weight. So weight's a very important requirement when you're going to be oscillating under a parachute.
Yeah, when you hit the ground, that's going to break something. So we talked. Here we go. Requirements to become a paratrooper. Let's just go through the 3-week training course at Fort Benning.
So it started out in 1942. You have volunteered, and that's a interesting point to tie in Band of Brothers here. For any of you that have seen the first episode, Lieutenant Lynn-Buck Copton is quite well known now, most certainly since Band of Brothers even wrote his own memoir. But in the show, him and Lieutenant Winters are riding in a Jeep, and Winters is giving him grief for gambling with his enlisted men. And Lieutenant Winters goes on and saying, they don't want somebody that's been drafted to get them killed. And now what's really unique about that is that you would not be drafted into the paratroopers. However, you could get drafted into the Marines or the Army and then volunteer to go to jump school where you as a volunteer. It's an all volunteer outfit. And so I always wanted to clarify that for folks. But, if it's 1942, Luke, and you and I are there, our first week is going to be called A stage. And that's where we're going to consistently be doing constant running, calisthenics, push-ups, jumping jacks, sit-ups, all sorts of exercises to start building our mental toughness. And part of that, although it's absolute hell, is to get these guys ready for the fact that they could be dropped deep behind enemy lines. And in order to maneuver at night and the day, link up with friendlies and reach your objective, you have to be physically fit to do this. And so they weed them out. Band of Brothers does a great job in that first episode of showing how quickly they transition from formation to running, anywhere from 3, 6, 8, 10 miles and beyond, just to see who can hack it. You could fall out on some of these runs and get back up and push through it. But when it came time for the actual physical fitness test, there were certain times you had to meet depending on which unit and outfit you were with. So, you get through the physical conditioning part, and then we start B stage. And that's a combination where we still continue to go on the physical fitness of it, but we start teaching you the fundamentals of how to land out of an airplane. They're not just going to take you up in a C-47 and be like, hey, jump out. You need to know the fundamentals of landing, how to shift and shape your body so that when you hit the ground, you're not breaking legs, breaking ankles, tearing muscles that are inside your knees, or even worse, paralyzing yourself or being killed. So they take about a week to sometimes 2 weeks just to train you at the ground level, jumping into sand pits. And then you're eventually going to start jumping from towers as we transition to C stage. And you read any paratrooper memoir, you listen to some of the interviews, jumping out of the planes didn't scare most of those guys. It was the towers that absolutely scared the hell out of them. Imagine these big cranes pick you up from a parachute from the ground, take you up 100, 150, 250 feet in the air, and they just let you go. And you start oscillating from that. And it's getting you prepared to, all right, at 250 feet, your body's falling at a certain feet per second. How do you prepare yourself for landing? And once you had successfully made it through C stage, the final stage, as a lot of the guys have stated in the books and interviews, is the easy stage. You make 5 jumps from a C-47 at varying altitudes. And on that 5th jump, upon landing, assuming you haven't broken anything, or even if you do perhaps break something on the last one, you earn these coveted jump wings that you now get to wear on your Class A's. And if you'll notice here, some of the paratroopers in Normandy and beyond would take their jump wings and pin them to their M42s. There's some photographs we'll see in that later to show that you are proudly a member of the airborne of an eventual unit, but you have made it as a paratrooper through what many consider to be the hardest Army training of the Second World War, emphasis on that.
Awesome. And my UPS has arrived, so I will dip out to sign for that. It's a very cool piece, and I'll drop you to the next one and talk away. I'll be right back.
So for those of you out there watching this and eventually going to see it, a lot of the people know of the 101st Airborne through Band of Brothers. So once again, I'll talk about that some. It does a really good job overall, but there are other units outside of E506. There are other regiments outside of the 506 that are officially parachute regiments. You've got glider infantry units. You've got parachute field artillery. So to kind of break down the 101st Airborne Division on D-Day with our parachute regiments, we're going to have the 501st Parachute Infantry Regiment, we're going to have the 502nd, and we're going to have the 506. Now, breaking down the Parachute Infantry regiments, each regiment is going to be made of 3 battalions. Each battalion is going to have 4 companies. You're going to have a headquarters company, and then you are going to have 3 rifle companies within that battalion. So, the breakdown applies the same across all 3 Parachute Infantry regiments of the 101st. So with the first one that we see here, 1st Battalion, you're going to have Able Company, Baker Company, and Charlie Company. 2nd Battalion, you're going to have Dog Company, Easy Company, Fox Company. And 3rd Battalion, you're going to have George Company, Item Company, and Howe Company there. Or I said that backwards. It's George, Howe, and Item. But it's the same breakdown. So we're going to take this, apply it to the 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment, and I am representing a trooper of Charlie Company, 1st Battalion, 502nd. And this breakdown is important. And the reason I say that is that while Easy Company 506 is arguably the most famous individual company of the 101st Airborne. In terms of the entirety of World War II, and this information comes from Mark Bando, who is considered by many to be the expert historian on the 101st in World War II, E506 only makes up 2% of the combat action of the 101st Airborne in World War II. You've got to think of the fact that we have all these other rifle companies, headquarters company elements that are going to be participating in the combat. You've got the 327th Glider and the 401st Glider Infantry Regiment that's going to come into play there. You've got my personal favorite, and one day I'll do a kit of them, is the 377th Parachute Field Artillery Battalion, who jump into combat with artillery guns strapped to the bottom of the planes, broken down in pieces in 9 to 10 man sticks, and jump out under the guise that they're going to get these artillery guns set up in combat and start providing fire support missions for the 502nd, especially in their assault on D-Day, and eventually that of the 101st Airborne before the naval sea bombardment begins and before field artillery pieces can be brought in offshore. So you've got all these elements that come into play to make up the 101st. You've got demo platoons, engineer sections, the 326 Airborne Engineer Battalion comes into play here in my mind. All these different units make up the 101st Airborne and their very unique story on D-Day.
Awesome. And then I'm assuming you talked about the glider regiments as well, 327.
Yes, absolutely. And, speaking of the gliders, before Normandy, a lot of the paratroopers did not have respect for the glidermen. And a lot of it was simply because of this cockiness, this arrogance that does come with the fact of what these guys have been through. But for the 101st, veterans, Normandy changed how they saw the glidermen. And it's not just how they fought. The 327th is going to perform expertly in Normandy, as well as the 401st, considering some of the actions they do. But it was when the paratroopers saw the aftermath of the glider landings, of broken and smashed gliders where crew are killed, torn apart on impact, severely injured, and how they rode in to France and into Normandy. That changed the perspective, and a level of respect was then gained by what the paratroopers saw that these glidermen had to go through there that would exist throughout the war.
I just have a quick question about the gliders. How many men could they put in a glider? Do you know? Is that kind of like the benefit of it? You could put more men on the ground quickly.
It's a fantastic question, Luke, and I'm glad that you brought that up. It's not even just the more men, because if that memory serves me correctly, and I'm no glider expert here, I've spent a lot of my time focusing on the 50 Deuce. I want to say that their men consisted of similar that of a stick of a C-47, 18 to 20 men, maybe a little more. But what the benefit of the glider is vehicles that can be brought in immediately. Jeeps that can be used for reconnaissance, for aid to bring in and move the wounded, anti-tank guns, field guns that could be brought in, extra heavy equipment that you just can't strap to these C-47s or the paratroopers can't jump into combat with. And that's where those gliders play a key role, especially in the Normandy invasions and beyond, and even before that. But at the same time, that's also one of the problems that you're going to see with the gliders is being loaded with too much equipment and too heavy, and they're made out of wood, gliding on the air that's going over and under the wings there. When you've got so much equipment, they fall, and they fall fast.
Man, another thing that's interesting is that these regiments are so small. You have a battalions of just 430 men. For just my general knowledge is, from the Marine Corps, a battalion's 1,000 men, a regiment's 3,000 roughly. So the airborne division, it's around 10,000 total with the gliders, I guess.
This is perhaps not the most accurate in terms of numbers, but it does a good breakdown. To give you an idea, to get the just to put it this way, you will have battalions. A battalion will fit into about 36 C-47s, anywhere from 18 to 20 men per C-47. And so you will see the D-Day serials as they take off from England generally consisted of 36 to 45 aircraft making up these flights of Vs. You take your fingers, make a V. You've got the lead plane here. You've got the wingmen here, and then they're all making a giant V. So when these guys jump, if the planes are still in formation, battalions land together, companies land together, platoons, in theory, land together. And we'll talk about how that did not go to plan when these guys jumped into Normandy.
Awesome. So ready for the next slide?
Absolutely, man.
All right. Here we go.
So here we have it, the 5-0 Deuce. Who is the 502nd? And I'll start by saying what got me into the 502nd, because I know that you'll definitely appreciate this, Luke, from our previous conversations. It was a video game that came out 2002, 2003, 2004-ish time frame called Brothers in Arms, Road to Hill 30. And in my opinion, that was the game that solidified me into wanting to learn about the paratroopers in World War II, but what really drove me to really understand the 502nd. And so as a kid, I took that information, and as I got into adulthood, I bought every book I could find on the 5-0 Deuce. Who were these men, these widow makers of the 502nd, as they eventually earned themselves the nickname and gave that based on their pocket patch we saw at the beginning there. So initially, they're constituted in Fort Benning, Georgia, and after eventually building up from 1 battalion to 2 to 3, they eventually are going to join the 101st Airborne in August of 1942. They're going to train in the United States, continuing to get jump experience, continuing to get in a cadre of NCOs and officers that you're going to see coming and going, before eventually they're going to get orders to set sail for destination unknown, where they are going to steam out of the United States on the SS Strattenhaver and are going to make their way to the United Kingdom. The voyage for them was really interesting because it took them 43 days to go to England. They had some problems. And this ship had to stop in Nova Scotia, where, according to Mark Bando and some of the interviews he's done, some of these paratroopers got into some shenanigans on the island of Nova Scotia, with a lot of their men being taken into service for the Commonwealth, and a lot of ladies on the island and men in the best physical fitness of their life, leaving the ships at times the best they could. But once the ship was fixed, they immediately set sail and eventually arrive, of course, in England, where they begin this intense training regime that intensifies, especially understanding combat maneuvers, combat breakdown of what they're about to eventually go into. And they had some ideas that it would be France, but things rapidly ramp up in the spring of 1944 with more combat jumps, or not combat jumps, more training jumps, nighttime maneuvers, map reading. And this is happening at every level, from a private like myself all the way up to the highest ranking officers, because even the regimental commanders, the lieutenant colonels, the majors, the generals are going to jump into France. They're not staying in England, and everyone is going to have to be facing the same problems there possibly. So on the 30th of May, 1944, the 502nd is going to be split into 2 different locations. You're going to have members of them are going to go to Greenham Commons. Some other members of the 502nd are going to go to Merrifield Airfield. Well, eventually they are literally dropped off into a barbed wire enclosed container, and no one is allowed in, no one is allowed out. And on this 30th of May, every single man of the 502nd knew what was coming, that within a few short days they would be jumping into combat for the first time.
It always comes back to Brothers in Arms. What a great game. They need a third. All right, so let's break down what you're wearing.
So we'll start.
Your weight's 150. You already told us that.
We'll start with the basic here. We've got the standard M2 helmet here. We've got our chin strap and our the chin strap here, of course, the A-frame webbing here we see. We've also got the 502nd heart that you can see that's going to be stenciled on the side of this helmet. Now, these hearts aren't just for fun or anything. They're actually regimental identifiers. The 501st is going to have a white diamond stenciled on their helmet, the 502nd a heart, and the 506 is going to have a spade. And the glidermen are going to ride in with clubs. You're going to have elements of the 377th Parachute Field Artillery Battalion and 101st Airborne Headquarters are going to have a circle with some different angles there at the 12, 3, and 4 o'clock position to denote them. The engineers are going to have an E stamped onto the side of their helmet. Now, what's that for? Well, on the ground at night, this will allow you to identify what units are near you. If you see a heart, it's the 502nd. Now, before Normandy, they were supposed to put these stencils or hash marks at the 3 3, 6, 9, and 12 o'clock position to identify if you're from the 1st Battalion, the 2nd Battalion, 3rd Battalion, and the headquarters for the regiment. The 502nd didn't put the hash marks in Normandy. There's been no evidence that actually shows that they did. All of the photographs you see are variations of a white heart stencil there. Some hearts are bigger than others, some are not. Now with the 506 and elements of the 501st, you do see the hash marks there in the photographs, but that's why you don't see it for this impersonation of the 502 in Normandy. Now, outside of my helmet there, we're going to go get started with the basic M42 jump uniform that we see here. And this is going to be replicated in what is called CC2. And that was a chemical agent that the uniform was dipped in to prevent gas, if there was a gas attack, from getting inside of the uniform. I have replicated mine with otter wax, but CC2 essentially makes the uniform unbreathable. A lot of guys in their memoirs or interviews talk about it feeling like wearing a rain jacket, where there's no insulation. You are just constantly sweating, and it's already heavy enough as is, but you would do the same for the wools to make sure that you can't have, any possibility of gas getting into the uniform, getting into your skin. And that just goes back to the fear of World War I. In these pockets I have here, I'm going to have extra ammunition. I'm going to have perhaps some breakdowns of D-bars or for protein to get me through. I might not have a chance to eat a full, I can't think of the name right now. I'm having a brain fart, but I might not get a full meal, but a D-bar is going to get me through what I need to eat for the day there. And then we got to continue to kind of analyze this itself. I've got all sorts of equipment here. I've got my webbing that I'm going to get ready to stand up and get through. All of this kind of weighs a ton. I've got my Air Corps pouches here. Okay, this Air Corps pouch, as you guys can see here, is loaded with live rounds only for the impersonation, but each Air Corps pocket contains 4 clips of M1 Garand 30-06 ammunition. Now, I've got 3 of these. I've got 2 here. I've got another one here. Now, if we do math on that, that equals 96 total rounds. On top of that, I'm going to have a 6-round bandolier or 6 clip bandolier that I'm going to wear that's going to give me an additional 36, or math is hard, 8 times 6, 42. So I'm looking at wearing 136 rounds of ammunition just on my person here. If I had one attached to my musette bag, maybe, or somewhere back here, I might be carrying a box of 30 caliber machine gun. I might be carrying some extra mortar rounds, simply because we're having to jump into combat with everything that we absolutely have. On tops of other weaponry, I've got a grenade attached here. There's white tape around it. That way that when I possibly get ready to use this here, and I've got it clipped in here a little bit, the spoon is still attached. So if the pin comes out mid-flight, comes out when I jump, it's not going to explode because the pin has activated the mechanism there. So before I throw this into a house, into a trench, or even to perhaps a German patrol walking along a road, I have to take the tape off, pull the pin, let the spoon fly, then toss the grenade. We can see our wonderful paratrooper dog Scout in the background, who has joined us today. And on tops of other personal fighting or weaponry, good chance I lose my rifle, depending on where it's located, depending on how my equipment's set up, depending on how fast I jump. So I'm going to have a fighting knife attached to my leg here. Don't know if you guys can see that one there, M3 fighting knife that's sharpened to a hole. And as need be, I'm going to have another small knife in this little pocket that you will see. This one is a real one from the Second World War, stuck on a zipper right now currently, but it's a spring activated knife. And Luke, I don't know if I can actually show that. I don't want your channel to get in trouble.
Don't.
So that's exactly why I didn't. But that would be perfect for trying to perhaps cut myself out of some shroud lines if I can. You definitely don't want to cut through the silk of a parachute. Really hard to cut silk. But all these little weaponry that I'm going to have, in this little M2 spring-loaded knife here, for personal defenses I need be, and etc. there. On top of that, in my musette bag that we see back here, I'm going to have rain jacket, extra clothes or extra socks, underwear, food, mess tin, mess kit, personal artifacts that you're going to see these guys carrying. And, realistically, in every pocket that you can see on this M42, I'm going to have stuffed what I think is extra. Now, for the 101st, this is their first combat jump. So a lot of these guys are carrying more equipment than they needed because they just generally didn't know. And that's going to come into an important talking point later when we talk about the jump and why these guys lost so much equipment, why the pilots were flying as fast as they did. Now, I might have a map. You'll see, especially as a private, you'll see some of these guys having a map outline of the drop zone. It's going to be an aerial photograph of when I'm parachuting down from 600 feet. This is what I should look for so I can find my way there. And so on top of all of this, considering what I would probably have, just in case I had the extra machine gun ammo, you're looking at 225 pounds. And that's not counting the parachute, the Mae West, the reserve chute. It weighs an absolute astronomical ton when you consider just trying to get up from sitting down with all that included.
And no body armor either, which is crazy.
No,
so it's
no body armor.
In the modern military, that's about a 30-year weight. I like to see, like, man, seeing your pockets on your blouse full of stuff. That's interesting. Yeah.
And it's part of it. And it's like there's actual stuff in here. For example, it's not just regular stuff. Sorry if you guys hear my dog whining back there. But this is one of my D-bars. So this right here, get this one out too while we're here to see it. Get a ration out while we're over here. Oh, gosh. Imagine trying to get all this stuff out in the middle of it. But right here, we have a partial dinner unit. And in that, we're going to have some charms. We are going to have some crackers to eat on. And we're going to have a little granulated sugar and some lemon juice powder. And part of the reason, it's so small in a partial unit, depending on what's happening, Luke, depending on my current situation, there's no guarantee I have time to sit down and properly eat something. And that's one of the things that these guys were stressed about, is making sure you have enough to snack on while you're on the move to your rally point, to your next objective, to wherever in the world you might be.
Yeah, I mean, the kind of interesting ties to the modern sense. We also used tape around our grenades in Afghanistan, and then we would call it like field stripping an MRE, where you take the MRE apart, you break it down because it would condense the size, So it's always about ounces equal pounds, pounds equal pain, less stuff to carry. All right, let's get you back up here onto your list of itinerary of things. Anything else you want to talk about there?
Well, and then we'll have the first aid kit. Now, the first aid kit, okay, I'll turn for this one, is going to be located right here. Now, part of the reason for that is that if I'm hit, and naturally, considering if I'm moving towards a enemy position and I get hit, momentum is going to carry me forward. That way, if I'm wounded, a medic or perhaps even a friend of mine or a comrade that's nearby can access that first aid kit, dress my wounds. Now, what's really unique is that if I take a pretty nasty wound to the leg or to the arm, and we see that it's bleeding pretty heavily and I need a tourniquet, this bandolier, okay, especially if it's empty, all bandoliers are issued with a nice little safety pin. You can take that safety pin out, take this strap, wrap it around whatever extremity that we need to tourniquet off, and use that pin to pin it shut, and boom, you've got a field modified tourniquet.
Awesome. And wow, I've gotten some bandoliers from Greece, and they still have that pin. I had no idea. All right, so musette bag, raincoat, 3 pairs of wool socks, 1 can bore cleaner, bath towel, 2 handkerchiefs, 1 can of oil, 50 sheets of toilet paper, gross weight 225, 3 condoms.
Now, with the condoms, we are liberating a country. And it was not specified to the troopers verbatim by all of their officers, but some of them also understood that considering what might happen if they get leave while they're in the field, or even if they come across some of these villages and there is no activity, things might happen. And so the condoms are literally there for those things. We're going to have we're going to even jump into France with French currency in our pockets that we can utilize there. Some of them are even going to have French dictionaries. That way we can try to translate. I speak a little French. It's nowhere near enough to get me around the countryside. It's what I took in high school. It's what I remember from high school. And so hopefully those things are going to help us navigate the world of this country. Are the citizens we're going to interact with, are they going to be hostile? Are they going to be grateful? Are they going to be resistance members? Or are they just going to be ordinary people?
Yeah, I mean, if you think about it, Econom's pretty lightweight, and it's much better than losing troopers to venereal diseases. So makes sense. And it wasn't our first time in France. All right, so here is our map of, I guess, Overlord in general and D-Day. So take it from there.
So we have our flight plan here. So we're going to have all across the southern coast of England there, from Ewe Pottery, Merrifield, Greenham Common. You're going to have the 101st Airborne Division is going to begin lifting off, and they're not going to make a beeline to France. We've got to lift off from our airfields, form up, the pilots do, with other sticks and serials. We're going to go through some photographs, but each serial has a chalk number. The first serial, you might be chalk 1 through number 36. The next serial behind you is chalk 37 through, let's say, 60. And then the next one might be chalk 60 through 99. And that is just going to determine what plane you are going to get on. You got to think there are going to be all sorts of planes at these airfields. If none of them have any identifiers, how do we know which one we are supposed to board? So the jump masters, and you'll see one in a photograph here. And if any of you have ever seen the Band of Brothers first episode, when they are walking across the tarmac with all their gear, Lieutenant Winter or Richard Winters is wearing a cardboard sign that has 67 written on it. And that identifies the chalk that he is. And to find the plane that has either chalk or has 67 written on the nose or on the side of the aircraft, because that's the aircraft they are going to board from Ewe Pottery. So the flight plan, once we get formed up, the pathfinders are already anywhere from 45 minutes to perhaps an hour in front of us. Mark the drop zones for us before we get there with hopefully Eureka beacons and halophane lights, and we'll talk about that when it's time. But we are going to fly southwest towards the island of Guernsey and Jersey, which are currently west of the Cotentin Peninsula there. Then our pilots are going to turn southeast and head straight for the west coast of France before eventually turning anywhere from 070 to 085 if they've stayed on course for a 10-minute flight that is going to take us to the drop zones. Once we turn 080 or so for our drop zone there, bound for DZA, which is what would have been my drop zone to land on. We're going to go through the procedures that they go through inside the C-47s, and boom, we find ourselves landing into France there. But this map is wonderful. You guys can find it on the internet. There's posters of it made available that just gives a great breakdown of the American and the British landing zones, with the Canadians included there from the beaches, and of course the British 6th Airborne and of the 82nd Flight Path there.
So it's kind of interesting. They completely go around Cherbourg or Cherbourg. I don't know. But all right, let's go to the drop zone.
If you click that link, it might show us.
I don't think that link's going to work for me. Hold on.
Excellent. I can pull the link up, because this one is pretty cool to show up and to share with you guys. At least I would like to do that.
It's our first time having a PDF. I'm going to require all future guests to have a PDF. Make my life even. Oh, it's on the next one, I think. Hold on. If we go to the next. Oh no, that's not the right one. I got it right. I got it right here. I'll add it.
Perfect. But while we're here, the 101st Airborne is going to be assigned 3 drop zones for their mission into Normandy. Drop zone A is where the entire 502nd Parachute Infantry is going to be designated to land as a regiment. And the 377th Parachute Field Artillery Battalion will also be jumping under drop zone A. Drop Zone C, and I should say this, that Drop Zone A is west of Saint-Germain-de-Verreville and south of Fouquerville. Drop Zone C, which is west of Sainte-Marie-du-Mont and kind of southeast of Sainte-Marie-Église, is going to be the assignment of the 1st Battalion 506, the 2nd Battalion 506, and the 3rd Battalion 501st. And Drop Zone D, which is east of Saint-Côme-du-Mont and north of Carentan, outside of an area known as Ongoville Plain. That is going to be the designation for the 1st Battalion 501st, the 2nd Battalion 501st, and the 3rd Battalion 506 Infantry when they are going to make these jumps into Normandy. So Drop Zone A is situated, like I said, kind of west of Saint-Germain-de-Verreville, and it's going to come into an important role later, but I wanted to kind of get this out early. As a paratrooper of the 1st Battalion 502nd, I should have landed on this drop zone if everything went to plan. And if we look at this map, and it's a great map, you can find it in the 101st Airborne book written by George Koskomaki, D-Day with the Screaming Eagles. And it shows an excellent depiction of the scattering of the 502nd. But we've got all these symbols here for our key. So a diamond is our headquarters company for the regiment. A standard white circle is the 1st Battalion 502nd. A circle with an outer line is going to be the 2nd Battalion, and a black circle is the 3rd Battalion. Now, look, I'm no mathematician, but how many sticks landed inside this drop zone?
I'm going to guess 45.
One. One stick actually landed on the drop zone. The rest of them are scattered about to the north, as far north as Monteberg, to the south, west of Sainte-Marie-du-Mont and south of Sainte-Marie-du-Mont. Some of these guys are going to land east of Sainte-Marie-Église. That is where Lieutenant Colonel Robert Cole, who was the 3rd Battalion commander, and eventual Medal of Honor recipient for his actions on June 10th, is going to land and gather a party. But it's a total scattering for the 5ODs. And it's going to add in a lot of chaos to the overall plan, but chaos in a positive way that we'll get to later. So you can go ahead and go to the next slide there, Luke.
Yeah, I'm just looking at that scale, 0 to 3 miles. So from like Saint-Marie-Église to Andeville-le-Haubert is like 3 miles. So if you're not even within, this is a 6 by 6 mile grid. A lot of walking will be done.
A lot of walking indeed.
All right. And then okay. And then
so,
this is, go ahead.
Here's our drop pattern. And so this is a wonderful map that was, of course, done. And some of you might be asking, well, how did they figure this out? After the troops returned to England, interviews were done based on the aircrew performance, but to figure out, where did you guys land? Did you land exactly where you're supposed to? Did you land fast? Did you have a normal jump? You know, what altitude did you jump from? So we can see DZA that's marked on this one, and you've got a few sticks to the north outlined on the edge there. DZC to the south has a heavy concentration of members of the 502nd and the 506, and DZD to the very far south has a huge concentration of troopers that landed on it in what was the worst drop zone for the 101st Airborne in terms of casualties and chaos there. But this gives you an idea of how the 101st was scattered about Normandy. If we look at the top of this map, well north of Monteberg, you've got a scattering of all sorts of troopers that should have landed on the 502nd drop zone of drop zone A. And the majority of the sticks that you see, those blue dots way, way, way up there, that's the 377th Parachute Field Artillery Battalion. They only had 2, maybe 3 sticks, if memory serves me correctly, come near drop zone A. The 377th will suffer the worst misdrop of any battalion size unit during the Normandy invasion. They suffer over 50% casualties, where the majority of the men that are dropped so far north are either killed or captured. Every June 6th, I always think of one paratrooper from North Carolina, Howard Lee Tart, who I wrote an article on, but he was a member of Battery A, 377th Parachute Foot Artillery Battalion, who's killed on June 6th by this misdrop well to the north, and his body's not found until June 29th.
That's so far away. What's that scale set? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So they're 10, 15,
20, beyond 20 miles away.
Yeah.
It's And, realistically, and you can go to the next slide, Luke, while I ramble here, elements of the 6th Airborne Division don't fare that much better neither. And it's not talked about enough by no means of their elements there and the Canadians that are going to jump in with them. But they had similar results of just a true scattering of forces. And while it was a damnable curse on some of the ones that were misdropped so far, the chaos does kind of work in the betterment of the favor for the overall plan. Now, this is one of my favorite photographs of the pre-invasion, and this is Captain Frank Lillyman's stick, who is going to initially form the Pathfinder School for the 101st Airborne. He was originally an officer within Item 502nd, eventually steps up and takes on this role of forming a Pathfinder School prior to the invasion. So the Pathfinders are going to fly in smaller sticks, and their job with their security teams to give them security and cover is to set up these Eureka beacons that the lead serials of each plane have this set to home in on the signal of the drop zone. So if you are the lead serial pilot for the 502nd and you pick up this Eureka beacon, you follow that beacon, and as you follow it, that will eventually lead you right to the drop zone. A lot of the Pathfinders are going to be, one, misdropped, or two, they couldn't find the Eureka sets. The Eureka sets didn't work, and they set up some halophane lights there. But Lillyman's stick is going to set up their halophane lights and their Eureka sets near Saint-Germain-de-Verville, roughly where they need to be. And they're going to have elements of the 506 hone in on their Eureka beacons. So it was a total scattering to an extent. Some of the Pathfinder teams fared very well up north, but some of the ones down south on DZD fared horribly because they literally jumped right on top of German headquarters at Saint-Côme-du-Mont with the 6th Fallschirmjäger Regiment in the back door of some Ostfront troops that are volunteers there, and it was a truly awful affair. The first 2 Americans killed in Normandy during the invasion were 2 Pathfinders of the 501st. Gene Sellers and Stanley Swarsky are killed within minutes of each other between 12:40 a.m. in the morning and 12:45 a.m. in the morning, landing essentially outside of German machine gun nest and getting hosed down immediately, dead before their feet realistically touch the ground.
That's brutal.
Go ahead, Luke.
Oh, nothing past that. It's just, do all that training, all that running, all that years long of prep. And then, it's just, that's how war is.
And it is. One of the most famous prayers associated with D-Day is Lieutenant Robert Wolverton's prayer. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Wolverton's prayer. He was the CO of the 3rd Battalion 506. And if we had more time, and if it was about 3506, I would have brought him up, but I'll bring him up for this. He was found on June 8th through 9th in an apple orchard outside of Saint-Côme-du-Mont, hanging from a tree with over 150 bullet wounds and bayonet wounds on his body, where eventually the Germans just used him as target practice as they were passing by before the area was liberated by American paratroopers of the 101st.
It just reminds you of the war is hell, William Tecumseh Sherman. All right, so this is them at the – sorry, go ahead.
Oh, you're good. But this is elements of the 502nd as they are getting ready for D-Day. This is a photograph taken on June 5th in the afternoon here. And we can see that they are gathering their equipment. They are donning their gear as need be that we see there, and gearing up for what is known as the biggest invasion of their life. This is the biggest moment of their life here. And so you can see numerous members in this photograph of the 2nd Battalion 502nd. And this is how we can identify the 2nd of the 502nd. They were tasked with wearing a white cloth around the left shoulder. So the 2nd Battalion, and that was their form of identification. The 1st Battalion is going to wear theirs supposedly on the right shoulder, and the 3rd Battalion wears theirs around the neck, these white scarves. A lot of photo evidence, reason I don't have one, doesn't have the 1st Battalion 502nd wearing them as much as people originally thought. But this is a great identifier of the 2nd of the 50 Deuce. Putting on their musette bags, gathering ammo, darkening their faces, getting ready to meet some of the higher members of SHAEF that are getting ready to visit them. Go to the next photograph, if you will, my friend. All right. So we got a great photograph here. One of my favorites. Anybody should be able to recognize the man on the left, smiling there with his head down. You know, that's General Dwight D. Eisenhower. Ike is going to visit members of the 502nd and the 501st because Ike had been briefed that over 80% of the Allied paratroopers involved in this operation were going to be dead. And Ike was so distraught and nervous that the invasion might fail, he wrote a letter that he dated July 4th instead of June 6th, making an announcement that the invasion had failed and that he was going to accept full responsibility, that it was not on the men who had died and sacrificed themselves, that it was all on him and that they should not be held to blame. So he visits these airfields because he wants to see the men that he's sending in battle. The men that he has been briefed aren't going to be coming home. But I wasn't somber about it. You know, he joked with the men. Where are you from? You know, what's your town like? You know, what sports did you play? I was a big fisherman. So if you mentioned your hobby was fishing, he spent a few extra moments talking with you one-on-one, soldier to soldier, because he knew that he needed to inspire these men for the job ahead of him.
One of the most underrepresented, underappreciated leaders in American history, for sure.
Absolutely.
You can just tell from that smile. I love having you on because you always you can build out these photos so much more. All right, yeah, here we go. Some more.
Well, and you know, as we build out these photographs, like you say, that we get a really good photograph of the gear here that's being worn. You know, you can see the Air Corps pockets on the trooper that is immediately to the left of the general, where his head's turned there, where he's holding perhaps 30-06 in-block clips. Maybe he's got some M1 carbine magazines in there. But what you'll see around the trooper in the middle here is you will see the cricket, the infamous D-Day cricket associated with the 101st, elements of the 82nd, depending on what sources you look at, and the 6th Airborne Division. Now, I don't have mine. Truth be told, I couldn't find it, but for my impression, that actually works because a lot of guys are going to lose these things. They're quite small. But for D-Day, the cricket is going to be used as a form of challenge and a password. If you guys have seen Band of Brothers, even elements of The Longest Day to an extent, it's a very simple system. If I hear Luke moving in the bushes and I can't see him because it's dark, I click it once. If he's a friendly paratrooper with his cricket, he clicks it twice. Boom. We know that we're friendlies. Not a word has been said. And they're called crickets because they were a child's toy that supposedly emitted the sound of cricket. But you can see other great elements of the gear here. The heavy scrim netting that we saw in my helmet earlier to break up your outline when you're moving through the hedgerows of France. You've got the pistol pouch there, or I would assume that's probably more than likely M1 carbine magazines being held there. But just so a lot of uniqueness for reenactors that want to get this right. You know, you have to spend hours poring over these photographs because, you know, when you do reenacting, when you do what I do as a living historian, you don't do this because it looks cool. And obviously it does when you consider the games that inspired me in Band of Brothers, but, you know, you do it to remember the legacy of the men that did this 82 years ago. And if you want to do that the just way, you do it the right way. And that's enough of my rambling on that there.
You're going to sell me to get into World War II reenacting. I can't afford any more hobbies. If you don't have your cricket, though, can you just use a K98 bolt?
Oh my gosh, I can't stand that scene. That's a great question. But, you know, a lot of people have seen this. What if you don't have your cricket? If you're a Pathfinder, your challenge and password initially is not going to be Flash and Thunder. The Pathfinders had a challenge and password they were to use until the main serials arrived, and then they switched to Flash Thunder. The Pathfinders, while they were on the ground, are going to use Boise and Idaho. Now, the reason for that is that way that they perhaps couldn't give the Germans the information or let the Germans that perhaps spoke English or understood it Flash and Thunder nearby. But, you know, once on the ground, you know, you hear movement and you don't have your cricket. They do. You say Flash. If they're a friendly, they say Thunder, and your reply is welcome. The British paratroopers will not use Flash Thunder. They will use their own challenge and password of Punch and Judy. But the reason why Flash and Thunder was decided is that due to how German words and pronunciation works out, that if a German that struggles speaking English tries to pronounce thunder, it will come out Wunder. And, if you hear somebody say Wunder, you don't ask questions. You just start shooting in that direction. Or if nobody gives the challenge and password, after you have tried, you start shooting in that direction, or you get the hell out of there, depending on your personal preference.
For those of you that have seen the greatest movie, The Longest Day, one of the paratroopers falls for the cricket, but it's not a cricket. It's a German chambering around with his K98. He does the little cricket, and the German goes rack, 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 and he jumps out. And then that high-pitched machine gun noise they use in those old movies, but great movie. All right.
So this is arguably one of the most famous D-Day photographs. And what I always like to point out in the hallmark center of this photograph is we see the trooper here wearing the Chalk 23. And that is Lieutenant Wally Swanson, who was an officer with Company E, 502nd Parachute Infantry. And he's currently having a conversation with Ike. Sky Jackson, who is another well-known member of E502, is in this photograph, and some other men that have been named since historians took a deep dive into it. But, once again, you just get a great shot of the gear and how it's worn. You see here on my own personal web gear, the black tape that is utilized around the straps. And if when Luke goes back to that photograph, the trooper that's closest to us, we can actually see white athletic tape wrapped around his suspenders to keep them from rattling and making noises. You will see all sorts of that gear interpretation there to try to limit their quietness. And if you look at this trooper closest to us, we can see what I believe, just based on kind of the distance of the photograph, is a M1 bayonet that is tucked right in there to his cartridge belt that he's got on as a rifleman. You can see the white stenciling of the heart that's there. And all these troopers that have gathered around to see General Eisenhower, and just to have these one-on-one moments with him. But in my personal take, it's my favorite photograph of the 5-0 Deuce before they went into Normandy. We got a color shot here of members of the 506, but great photograph that shows them putting on their, and it's been colorized. I can't remember who colorized this one, but donning their jump gear. You've got the Mae West. We've got the gas brassard that if we've been exposed to gas, this is going to turn a shade of pink or red to identify that we have had a gas exposure. They're putting on parachutes. They've got their gas mask on, and they're getting ready and to take on this great endeavor. And what I love about these photographs is that I wish that I could just go back in time and just listen to these men talk. What kind of conversations are they having before their jump into destiny? What kind of thoughts are these men having? What is the anxiety and the stress like of knowing what is coming for them, or even the unknown? So here we've got members of the 2nd Battalion, 502nd, walking towards the tarmac. We have gas mask bags done on their left hip. You've got ammunition. They're carrying their machine guns, their rifles. The trooper that is third from the rear, that's got the white tape around the bag there, that's believed to be possibly holding explosives, just based on kind of what we see with some of the demo men utilizing. They've got, some of them are wearing the leather gloves. I go without the leather gloves, just personal preference there, because you see a lot of guys not wearing them, but they're heading out, all smiles. Are they smiling for the camera? Are they smiling because they feel, euphoric about what they're about to do? What's going through their minds right now as we get ready to take on this great invasion that they've trained for so many years for?
It reminds me of when we looked at Able Company 128th and like how young and just full of smiles, and then like they're the greatest generation, right? So these are the gentlemen that were growing up. They surrounded us, especially here in the United States, and it's just interesting to see that euphoria, the smile, just the youngness. Like they're obviously all young men. They're all bought in. Like it's motivating. It just reminds me of that movie. Yeah.
And whenever we get to the combat side of things, I've got some quotes that I'm going to bring in from a lot of the sources that I've used that will really bring this on. But another photograph of the gear and the equipment making their way towards the C-47s. And you can literally see the pockets like you see on me bulging with what they've got stuffed in there, depending on what they've chosen to put in there, from food, ammunition, personal items there that they're going to need. Continue on, Luke. And then we've got members of the 2nd Battalion, 502nd. I believe this is Fox Company. They've got all their gear on, and they are now beginning the process of boarding their C-47s. These guys weighed so much, a lot of them, that they could not pull themselves into the C-47. They had to have either the loadmasters on the planes or their friends behind them push and pull to get them into the aircraft with how much equipment they're carrying. And that's an important conversation when we get to it later about why the jump did go wrong for so many of them to an extent when it comes to their equipment loss. Great shot there of troopers literally picking and pushing to help get their friends inside. We've got a shot of the shovel that's being worn there to help dig into our fighting positions or our slit trenches a little later on. And then this is a great photograph of Doc Lage, George Lage, who was the battalion surgeon for the 2nd Battalion, 502nd. Mark Bando was able to get in touch with Doc Lage in the photographs that he took. And he took a lot of photographs of his stick, but also a lot of photographs in Normandy, even some rare color photographs that he shot with the camera he had at the time. And they are truly wonderful just to break down the equipment and some of the men that Doc Lage jumped into Normandy with. And, you can see the personal preference here on how this trooper here has his M3 fighting knife at the front. His gas mask bag is kind of cockeyed there. He's got an Air Corps pocket hanging from one of his shoulder straps right here. You just see uniqueness on how the 101st and even the 82nd was jumping into combat. And this is a man I mentioned earlier. This is the very famous photograph of Lieutenant Colonel Robert Wolverton, the battalion commander of 3506. And I'll leave it with this and we can go on to the next one. But he, the prayer that he asked his men, he gathered the entire battalion of 3506 together and said a prayer. And in his prayer, he asked that his men would die as men would die, without complaining, just doing what they believed what was right to make the world free and better. And like I said, he meets a horrible fate. Most of his stick meets a horrible fate where they land in and near an apple orchard outside of Saint-Côme-du-Mont, either being killed or captured by the Germans, and him being killed. 3506 took devastating casualties on their drop onto Drop Zone D, and maybe we'll get together for another episode just about Drop Zone D and the horrificness of that there. And this is a very famous photograph of members of Fox Company 506 inside of a C-47, because many of you might not have seen what it is like inside a C-47. Now, I can't remember the platoon leader that is standing in the middle, but he's actually reading, if memory serves me correctly, it's either Ike's invasion letter or they're reading Colonel Sink's letter, the Night of Nights letter that George Lodge famously does in Band of Brothers. But, we see the equipment here. And what always starks me, we see a bazooka strapped to a leg bag. And if memory serves me correctly, that was Bob Nudie, who had the bazooka attached to him, jumping into combat with the bazooka attached to the leg bag. That just blows my mind, the trust of jumping with a bazooka attached to your leg, knowing that very well it could break your leg, break your hip, and have devastating results.
Yeah, chewing it, having your face go into the buttstock of an M1 Garand has got to be rough, but a bazooka
absolutely. And now we can kind of shift to when we can come back to that photograph. But I know that with our outline, definitely kind of get into the stories of some of the weapons and the initial drop itself. So when the C-47s are gathering and forming up over England in their different waves, the 502nd is the vanguard. The Pathfinders, like I said, are in front of them, but the 502nd Parachute Infantry is leading the way for the 101st Airborne and the 82nd Airborne. The 82nd jumps after the 101st at Sainte-Marie-Église. So as the 502nd takes this turn and starts steaming east across the Continent Peninsula, the all of the sticks of the 101st and 82nd are going to hit this very dense fog and cloud bank over the Kootenai Peninsula, very thick. So, these planes are flying in a V formation, meant and designed to allow these platoons and battalions to land near one another. If it was a perfect condition, the jump would have went perfectly. But this is a time well before you have IFR, before you have any kind of like modern navigation that we have in aircraft today. So these planes hit this cloud bank and pilots scatter. They start pulling up, they start diving, they pull to the left, and the serials spread out so they don't have any collisions in this cloud bank. So these once tight formations that were all following the heading of the lead aircraft have now widened significantly. And when these guys pop out of this cloud bank, and by this point, the troopers, if you've seen Band of Brothers, have already gotten the red light. That means they're 10 minutes from the drop zone. They are standing up. They've hooked into the cable that runs the axis of the airplane. They've checked their equipment. They've sounded off for their equipment checks, meaning that they're strapped in. They've got everything. They're ready to go. And the jump masters, sometimes jumping first, sometimes jumping last, are standing by. So they pop out of this cloud bank, and a lot of these guys reported just seeing a rainbow of tracer fires meeting them, of 20 millimeter anti-aircraft guns, smaller caliber weapons. Were some reports of 88s. We take that for how it comes, but definitely a lot of 20 millimeter fire coming up and exploding around them. It is not going to plan. Now, for some of the pilots that flew in the 101st, the varying troop carrying groups there, this is their first combat flight too. And so these pilots and co-pilots, some of them are panicking. And I will never say that it was all of them, but some of them are. They're flooring the throttles. These guys are supposed to jump at 110 miles an hour. Some of these C-47s are doing in excess of 150 miles an hour, bobbing and weaving at 400 to 500 to 600 feet altitude. Guys in the back are bobbing and weaving. They're falling. You've got small arms fire and shrapnel coming up through these C-47s. So some of the pilots do panic by far. They turn on the green light way too early. And you've guys that are dropping in the 82nd zone of action. Some of the pilots of the 502nd, at least two sticks that belong to Able Company 502nd, their pilots turned on the green light too late. And they jump into the channel where the entire stick of Able 502 with their company commander, I can't remember his name right now, they drowned in the channel. That entire stick did. The second stick that jumped into the channel of A502, the majority of them drowned, but a few of them were rescued. But that's the reality of some of the situations. You have some sticks of the 501st, their pilots were so panicked, they never turned on the green light. You've got troopers standing there. They don't jump until the green light comes on, and they don't get the green light, and they literally get flown back to England. Some reported NCOs of the 101st and officers threatened to shoot the pilots if they did not turn around, and some of those sticks did and dropped them over France. The jump altitude is set. Some sources state 1,500 feet. Some sources state as low as 750 feet. Because if these guys jump from 10,000 feet, well, that's too damn high. They're just going to be swinging and oscillating there forever, easy targets. The lower they are to the ground, the quicker they have the chance of reaching the ground safely. But some of these guys swear to their dying day that they jump from 400 feet at 150 miles an hour, where Don Burgett, Tom Rice are some examples of some stories there that I can think of. They literally talk about jumping out, parachute opens, a few seconds goes by, and they slam into the ground. And fortunate it didn't break any bones, but they're just bruised for weeks. Other pilots perform the perfect drop in the middle of all this chaos. They slow down their plane to 110 miles an hour. They even lift the tail, as was taught in training. And these guys on some of these sticks, not a lot, say, well, it was a perfect practice jump. It was like everything that we were supposed to do. Now, as all of this is happening, why do some of the pilots fly faster? Some historians and some of the veterans themselves talked about later that the 101st, a lot of the troopers were carrying so much extra weight that the pilots had never trained with the paratroopers carrying that much weight into combat. And, C-47s, like any aircraft, they have a gross weight. And some of the pilots knew their planes were overloaded and that in order to keep the planes in the air, they had to fly them faster. Well, the unfortunate downside is they're carrying all this equipment. You jump out of a plane at 140, 150 miles an hour. When that parachute opens automatically, your leg bag, perhaps even your shoulder harnesses, because some guys report their web gear breaking, their musette bags, their rifles, because gravity kicks in when that parachute happens, it's ripped off from them. So when they hit the ground, as many of you have probably seen in Band of Brothers, there's no leg bag. Some of them are missing everything but a jump knife, maybe a couple of hand grenades. Maybe they've got everything but their rifle. But they've been trained on how to fight in that circumstances, but it's certainly not ideal. Meanwhile, some guys report having a perfect jump to where they didn't lose the leg bag, to where they have all of their equipment. And a lot of that really just depended on the circumstances of the pilot and the gross load of the airplane. And Luke, if you've got questions or want to comment, I'll take a breather for a sip of water here.
No, I remember in Band of Brothers, Winters drops down, right? He doesn't have an M1 Garand and he runs around and but in the show, he drops around. He's surrounded by men with arms. But imagine jumping in, you look around, you don't have anything. And unlike, Call of Duty, Band of Brothers, any of those games, you can't just go up to a gun and press A or knock out a German real quick and pick up his gun. So it all comes back to video games in the early 2000s.
It does. And, and it's interesting, that, for example, in Band of Brothers, we see Winters eventually arming himself with a Kar 98. And we'll talk about what actually happened at that event later. But these guys, before they went into combat, German weaponry was brought around to familiarize themselves with it because you could lose your weapon. Anything could go wrong. And that way you have an idea of how these German weapons work. That way you have something to utilize. And there are troopers of the 101st. Dan McBride comes to mind, who used a MP or STG-44 that many of you would recognize on D-Day, that he got after he and this German soldier essentially rotate around this hedgerow, shooting at each other and changing positions until Dan got the better drop of it. Dan was with the 2nd of the 50 Deuce. Dick Ladd, who was with the 502nd, ended up picking up PPSH-41 on D-Day. He didn't know that's what it was, but he described it later on as a round drum magazine with Russian markings. It's a PPSH-41 that had been taken off of some German Ost volunteers, Eastern Front soldiers or conscripts that had surrendered that he used on D-Day. He killed 3 German soldiers, or Georgians believed, that rushed him, according to Mark Bando. But possibly in the same light of that, Dick perhaps friendly fired unintentionally Major Vaughn of the 502nd, who was a member of their S4, if memory serves me correctly, because Dick never figured out how he could have been killed, except that except Major Vaughn was between him and the Georgian soldiers that rushed him. But it's one of those things of combat. He doesn't know.
That's brutal. All right, so ready to go to the next one there?
You tell me, man.
All right, we'll move.
So when we did the outline of this, and there's a reason I put this picture in here, we talked about the importance of the weaponry of the 101st, the 82nd, but we are detailed here with the 101st. The trooper here that's holding the M1 Garand is actually a member of the 377th Parachute Field Artillery Battalion. And like I said earlier in the stream, they suffer the worst misdrop of any unit that's at the battalion size during Normandy. And so they only recovered 1 out of 12 of the artillery guns they were supposed to jump into Normandy with. So a lot of these artillery paratroopers fought as regular infantry with the 502nd that they linked up with, or elements of the 506, well into the Normandy campaign, until they captured German artillery field pieces that they could utilize and figure out how to fire there, which they eventually do. But the M1 Garand is an iconic American weapon, but it's very important in Normandy. Your standard rifleman is going to be carrying an M1 Garand. We can see the trooper that is kind of in the background of this, with no scrim on his helmet, more than likely a member of 3502. We really don't see them using a lot of scrim in the photographs. He is holding an M1 carbine with the folding stock, which was designed for the paratroopers, particularly officers. It's designed for crew-served weapons. Members of the 30 caliber machine gun teams, 60 millimeter mortarmen, And it's designed for the anti-tank teams as a light weapon that can be carried for personal protection. Some guys liked the carbine, some did not, especially with the wire folding stock, because it really added and took a lot of the kick that comes with the wooden stock and added some additional there. Some guys didn't think it had the stopping power. It just depends on what account you want to look out there. But the real weapon of Normandy that did become a favorite by what I call the willing killers of combat was the Thompson. The M1A1 Thompson, sometimes you can see guys with the M1928 version, was lethal in Normandy, simply for the fact it's close range fighting. You know, a lot of the guys are using 20 round mags. So sometimes in some photos, depending on who you ask, you can see occasionally some 30 rounders, but a lot of 20 rounders. But it puts out a rapid rate of fire. So you take all of this to the German weaponry of the bolt action Kar 98. You know, there were Americans that did jump in with Springfields. Assistant squad leaders had them because they had the Grenadier attachments for them, and the Grenadier attachments for the M1 Garand weren't necessarily readily available to everyone yet. But the firepower that Americans can put out in small elements with a carbine, an M1 Garand, a Thompson, a 30 caliber machine gun, maybe a BAR that they got out of a glider, because you don't see the 101st jumping into Normandy with BARs. That's why I preference that. Is abysmal compared to a German with a Kar 98, maybe the slower fire rate of the MP40, but there's also the fearedness of the MG42. But, you know, the Thompson is well known. For example, Lieutenant Spears from D506 is known for his supposed war crimes or atrocities. And today we call them war crimes. At the time, it was seen as a part of the job because the 101st and the 82nd and the British 6th Airborne Division were under orders, no prisoners for the first 24 hours. Some guys took that literally. Other men had a problem with shooting an unarmed man that has surrendered. Others did not. Lieutenant Spears was one of those that did not have that issue. There are numerous accounts, according to Mark Bando, of Lieutenant Spears, along with other members of D506 and other paratroopers as well, shooting these prisoners. And there's a reason for it. Are they cold-blooded, ruthless killers? Maybe. But in reality, do they have the means to take care of German POWs in the midst of the invasion when seaborne infantry has not reached them? They can't. You know, what happens if 40 Germans surrender to 4 men? You know, you might be armed with semi-automatic and automatic weapons, but if they rush you, can you get them all, or do they have a chance? And that's kind of the mindset some of these guys have. So some of the paratroopers of the 101st had no problems doing what they had been briefed to do. Others didn't, and that's something that they weren't going to partake in. But the Germans, to an extent, are going to do the same. You see a lot of really terrible atrocities in the hedgerow fighting of Normandy by the Germans, the Americans, and the British. And it's really curious as to who started it. There are paratroopers of the 101st that reported seeing their friends or finding comrades that had been hung up in trees over German field gun positions that had been hacked to death with machetes that they were carrying, bayoneted to death. Some more macabre and grim accounts report guys finding American paratroopers that had their manhood removed before they were executed in cold blood, or even removed after they had been executed. So for a lot of these guys in their first taste of combat, they're seeing this firsthand, and that's a chain reaction of events because some of these guys see this and they're like, well, if I surrender, this is what happens to me. And the next time they see a German soldier surrendering, they don't think twice about killing that soldier. Or worse, atrocities happen on both sides. And it's a minority, most certainly, compared to the overall combat action, but it still happens, and it has to be talked about because it was a reality. I mean, can you imagine, Luke, if CBS, CNN, or any mainstream news media with live footage cameras had been a part of the Normandy invasion? Doesn't matter for which side, that country's going to lose the war because people were not ready to handle the realities of what was taking place in the hedgerows.
I remember hearing that during the premiere Band of Brothers, they invited Spears out to France, and he Cap or Major Winters had to actually reach out and be like, "You're not going to be facing war crimes." I didn't realize that he had done it more than once in the movie
Yes.
or in the show. It seems to be like a one-off thing, but I mean, if you did it more than once, that would make sense why he was actually aptly nervous that he would get charged.
In the show, they kind of frame it as this thin line of reality to myth. But it was a few isolated incidents. If memory serves me correctly, and I've got an excellent list of books here I'll pull out later, it was not a group that was as big as in the movie, but numerous small groups. And he wasn't alone. Like I said, Jumbo, oh gosh, I can't think of Jumbo's last name, who was a member of D506 and was with Spears. Participated in it. And it's true. If you've watched Band of Brothers, Spears did shoot one of his own troopers. I think it was June 7th, maybe June 8th. And this individual, whose name I can't remember, was very intoxicated. Spears had given him an order and he refused it. This man started to reach for his weapon, and Spears told him, he said, "If you're going to reach for that, you better use it." He reached for it and Spears shot him first. And if memory serves me correct, this individual, Jumbo, was nearby and said that he could hear the bottles of Calvados that this man had been drinking busting as the slugs of the 45 were entering him and killed him. And Spears was there was going to be an investigation, but if memory serves me correctly, an officer of Dog Company was eventually killed the next day and nothing ever came of it.
Man, I interviewed a World War II Philippines vet. He was in the army. He talked about when they took Manila, the infantry would take surrendered Japanese away and just pop them around the corner. When I was like in sixth grade, it's like, I interviewed Mr. Slessor from, he's passed out. I interviewed, yeah. I mean, it's just how it was, right? Like it
is. And you know, the Mark Bando books, for anyone out there, are a must-have because they are some of the best, realistically, and the Coach K books, George Koskamaski, are phenomenal. But Bando got close with these guys at numerous reunions in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, and these guys started to open up and tell him everything. Now, not everyone did, but a lot of these guys did, and Bando was honest with it. You know, his most rare book is called Avenging Eagles, and it's the oh shoot, I actually read the title of it right here because I've got it right here. Don't know why I'm trying to remember it off the top of my head, but it's called Avenging Eagles, and it's called The Forbidden Tales of the 101st Airborne Division in World War II, and that's exactly what it is, of honest tales of combat, of life before the war, life during the war by the members of the 101st.
Yeah, it's history. It is what it is.
It is.
All right, let's go. We got some paratroopers in. They seem to be, they've lost some of their things.
So this is a photograph that is taken outside of Sainte Marie de Mont, if memory serves me correctly. And for the historian nerds out there, hopefully, I got that right. It's been a while since I've looked at this one. But yes, they're currently using this as an identification. They've got an M1 rifle here with a flag attached to it. And yeah, we do see a lack of equipment. Musette bags being gone. We see some webbing there. And, you know, maybe it's one of those things of where they dropped their packs before they moved into the combat around this village, or if they were just ripped off in the jump. But as we get into the combat of it, you know, the 502nd had some pretty unique objectives for D-Day. One of them included knocking out a 4-gun, 122 millimeter battery that was located east of Saint-Germain-de-Verville, that the 2nd Battalion, 502nd, was to get into those gun emplacements and knock them out, and to destroy the German garrison that was located at an objective called W, X, Y, and Z. You have also securing the causeways number 3 and 4 off of Utah Beach and eliminating any German troops retreating off of the causeways as the 4th Infantry Division is eventually coming ashore, and then setting up roadblocks near the village of Fouquerville with the 1st Battalion, 502nd, and holding off any German counterattacks that are coming down if looking at a map here from the northwest or so in that general area there. And so with the overall scattering of the 502nd, a lot of the members of the 502nd eventually found their way to where they were going to be, and some worked in mixed units. But the German 4-gun battery was destroyed in a bombing raid, and there were not any Germans at the battery site at all. But the German garrison at W, X, Y, and Z is going to be portrayed in the video game, of course, Brothers in Arms. But the real life counterparts to that were Harrison Summers of Baker 502, if memory serves me correctly, who is going to earn a Distinguished Service Cross for his actions that day. Private John Camion and Private William Burt, who are going to go through this building. It's a series of buildings. They weren't barracks. You can still go to them today, and you can still see the bullet impacts on these buildings. And Summers, Camion, and Burt are going to eliminate, in numbers fluctuate and vary, but anywhere from 60 to 80 German soldiers, realistically, just the three of them, eventually later two of them, Camion and Summers, going door to door, alternate who goes in first with the Thompson, and hosing down to the defenders who were described as not knowing what was happening, eating breakfast, sleeping in their beds, or just lounging around and about the house, not realizing that the Allied invasion of Normandy had arrived at their front doors.
Well, that's a law of surprise. All right, and then next up, I see some interesting rifles here.
Yes, we do. You'll actually see a captured Kar 98 here by the trooper who was second from the right. And we can also notice just how some of his gears changed. Like I said, these M42s get pretty hot and toasty. We can see some parachutes that they've taken from their own chutes and wrapped around their necks. We've got a hodgepodge of how they've got their gear worn. We've got some of the gas mask bags there. But this is a photograph taken in the early hours as sunlight has came up on June 6th. If memory serves me correctly, this is near Pflugerville, Ravenouville. I do not believe this is near Marmion Farm, but I very well could be wrong on that, and I will accept when I'm wrong on that. But just a great photo of these guys on D-Day. Go ahead to the next one. Now, this is of the Marmion Farm. This is one of the more famous 101st photographs on D-Day. This was a hodgepodge of troopers from all different units gathering up at the Marmion Farm here under the command of Major John Stopka, who was XO of 3502. We can see a member here with a white dot on his helmet and a small slash down, member of the 377th Parachute Field Artillery. We've got 506ers here. We've got 502ers here, and maybe some very scattered elements of the 501st. But really interesting is that you're going to have members of the 507th Parachute Infantry that was with the 82nd Airborne get misdropped in this Ravenouville, Pflugerville, Marmion region. They're going to link up. And the Stopka force is going to play a key role on D-Day, sending out combat patrols, hunting for German troops and ambushing them, putting out outposts and fending off several German counterattacks until the 7th of June, before the Stopka force begins to move their way towards the 502nd gathering areas, towards Sainte-Marie-du-Mont, as the 502nd is eventually going to play a key role during the Carentan Causeway engagement.
Yeah, it hurts me to this day when, what was that character? Corporal Doyle dies. Right?
Yes.
Second Brothers Army. Yeah. We have to game that out, man. I think it's still multiplayer. All right, next slide.
And this is another very famous photograph that you can see in almost any book that deals with D-Day and the 101st. But we've got members of the 502nd and even some Easy Company members, Easy 506 members in this photograph at the Marmion Farm, showing off some war trophies here. That is James Flanagan, who was with the 502nd, holding the swastika there that he had captured that morning, taking off one of the buildings at Marmion, if memory serves me correctly. But we've got a trooper with machetes. times, machetes were jumped into combat by some of these men to hack down at the brush in front of them, or if necessary, used as personal defense or assault weapons. But you really get a good photograph here of the combat load that these guys have and how many of them are carrying numerous grenades, anywhere from 2, 3, 4, sometimes 5 and 6. Some of these guys are carrying over 200 rounds of ammo. You can see how some of their blue pants have become unbloused just due to the general bagginess of the M42 pants and wrapping around. You can see variations in jump knives here, scrim users and and those who didn't, just because the fact scrim is great when breaking out, trying to break up the outline of your silhouette. But when you're moving through dense vegetation, for example, I'll pull my helmet up right here so I have to get out of my chair. A lot of these, this scrim, it's going to get snagged on twigs, on brush, and it's going to pull your head back. So a lot of the guys, I would say a lot, but some of them you will see didn't want scrim, or they even take the whole helmet netting off so they don't have to worry about it getting snagged up.
Yeah, but it takes away the cool aspect and looking cool.
It does.
I love I love when the Marines do. I love when the Marines had their scrim or whatever from like Battle of Fallujah, urban environment. They got this. I never got it issued to me, and one thing I always wish I had. I think it looks cool, but that doesn't.
3-1 in Fallujah and those famous photos. Oh yeah.
Yeah, that's like iconic, right? It's just it breaks it up. And they fought in the city, and we fought in the farm fields, but we didn't get one, and they got one. It's one of the many things.
It make sense, right?
None of them make sense. All right. Oh, here we go. Well, this will knock out the happiness.
Yeah. This is the reality of a Crash C-47. And I can't remember which stick this is. It wasn't with the 502nd. I want to say it was either the 501st or the 506. But it's reality. Due to the missed droppings, it was not uncommon for officers, NCOs, or guys to show up 5 and 6 days, 7 days after they had jumped to they finally reached up with their units. But you've got officers that don't report in on D-Day, and people are like, well, have you seen so-and-so from this stick? It's like, no, nobody's seen them. And it's like, well, if nobody's seen anybody from this stick, well, we suspect that they were probably shot down. And so as these units move through these fields and throughout the Norman hedgerows, some of them are going to stumble upon crash sites. And graves registration is going to have a very difficult time over the next several weeks of burying the dead of Normandy. I talked to a few Normandy veterans in my life. All of them described the one thing Normandy had in common with any other experience was just the smell of death everywhere. That you have thousands of decaying bodies everywhere due to the chaos of the paratroopers, the seaborne infantry fighting, and eventually the front lines moving. You have Allied air attacks. You have the pre-invasion bombardment. You also have the thousands of French that are killed in the invasion by the bombardment, by the war itself. There's no time to bury the dead. And it is just this pungent stink that is just everywhere, that all of them have recognized with it. Even the Commonwealth troops in the memoirs I've read there, just distinctive smell. And this is one of the reasons for it. You also have, guys that are hung up in trees, guys that have drowned, guys that were shot when they hit the ground. And there's just so many bodies from both sides of the fighting. It's reality. And it made many of the survivors became numb to it because it was the reality of war that was hitting them in the face.
Yeah, man. And it's just like the scale of everything. Utah Beach is only a couple miles away. So you could run to Utah Beach in 20 minutes, if it was the perfect day, if you had a good pair of shoes. And it's just thousands of men are just compacted into this tiny distance. And I think that's something like when you look at the maps, if you don't look at the scale, right, you're like, I don't really know what this is. But when you look at the scale, you're like, oh, these guys are just right on top of each other.
And it's great that you point that out. The amount of fighting realistically and chaos that ensues just from the paratrooper perspective of the 50 Deuce in the DZA area, from Fouquerville, where some of them were taken POW and got involved in some nasty house-to-house fighting, to Lieutenant Colonel Robert Cole and troopers of 3502 setting up behind Causeway number 3 and literally gunning down German soldiers as they are coming off of the beaches. There is fighting everywhere. And it's kind of one of the chaos and confusions of that night when these guys are jumping in to combat. There, that the enemy is around you. You are in their back door. You've got gunfire sporadically, sometimes more heavily popping off near you. And, what American weapons sound like, but it's like, well, what distance is that? A lot of the guys that first night described hearing the firefighting, and every time they got to where the shooting was, they just saw bodies. People had gone, bodies from both sides. And some of these guys not even encountering German soldiers to engage with in combat, avoiding their patrols, but not getting to fire their weapon on the first day, just due to the circumstances and hiding from the patrols for those that were dropped deep behind enemy lines. And on top of that, you've got the seaborne soldiers eventually coming ashore at Utah Beach. So the German troops that are caught between DZA, Fouquerville, Ravenneauville, Saint-Germain-de-Verville, Sainte-Marie-de-Mont, Poupeville are now caught between the paratroopers that are knocking on the door behind them, the infantry moving inland. A lot of them start to surrender. A lot of them are taken prisoner as more troops do come inland and they have proper means to take care of them. But then, you go a mile down the road and people are fighting like cats and dogs for their lives because there is no front line. And that's one of the things I try to tell people, that yes, you do have a beach invasion that's happening. For many of the troops that were dropped inland, the front line's ever changing. Literally, the front line is entirely around you, depending on your circumstances in those early days.
Yep. All right, let's move to the next one.
And a shot of a mixture of 101st and an 82nd trooper on the very far left. You can always tell it's an 82nd trooper just by the American flag that's being worn on his shoulder there. You don't see that with the 101st. I believe there were two elements of the 101st. 3501st, I think they're HQ, and I want to say members of the regimental HQ 506 jumped in with American flags. The rest of the 101st did not. And it's one of those little details you see versus we see 82nd troopers, the majority of them jumping in with the stars and stripes and the 48 stars there on their right sleeve that would be over here.
Is that flag reversed? Or is it like how it should be? I guess
flag is exactly how it should be.
Okay, yeah, because it throws me off that they reverse it, but these colors don't run. They for anyone that doesn't know, if you look at the modern representation, anytime you see a U.S. service member with the flag on their right shoulder, the U.S. has now reversed where the Union is, so that way the Union is facing forward. It's interesting to see anyways.
And then we've got a great shot of some 50 deucers here that have taken German prisoners on D-Day. And this photograph is taken. We can see the trooper closest to us has an M3 grease gun. You don't see a lot of them, but they were definitely present in Normandy. Another weapon that was generally liked and respected for its firepower that it could carry out. And it's significantly lighter compared to the Thompson. Thompson's heavy as hell compared to the grease gun. But for these German POWs, they were fortunate to be captured when they were. As more groups of paratroopers do get together, more POWs are being taken in some regards. And the POW interactions, it all depended on the individual trooper, what they had seen, what they had done that day, determined, the outcome for the German POWs. And it's the same thing for the Americans that are taking POW. Some of the Americans that are taking POW are treated somewhat decently by the Germans. Some are treated horribly. They're beaten. They have jaws broken. They're stripped of anything, clothing that they could take and forced further into other areas, some of them taken to St. Lo eventually. And then, you have some American POWs that are executed by the Germans just because it's this back and forth tug of war of the realities of the Second World War and what was happening. Now, this is one of the men that I definitely want to talk about, and definitely go to the next photograph there, Luke. It's a part of the same series here. But the man that we see from our perspective on the far right is Ben Schwab. And Schwab was a member of the Fox Company 502nd. He knew Joe Pistone very well of Fox 502. But Schwab earned a Silver Star on D-Day for his lone man charge of this German gun battery that he is personally credited with killing 8 of the German defenders. A hodgepodge group of Fox 502ers and some other elements of the 502nd come across this German battery on D-Day. And this is not the Holdy battery, if memory serves me correctly. This is definitely not the Braycore Manor battery. This is another battery, and maybe it was the Holdy. Can't recall off the top of my head now. There are numerous German gun batteries there, but Schwab is literally in this assault going to stand up and fire his M1 from his hip as he advances on the German position walking. And Joe Pistone and other members that are there are just stunned by this. Bullets are flying around and he's just standing there, bayonet fixed, just plinking shot after shot as he's walking into this position. And they thought it was one of the most astounding things that they had ever seen. And they eventually knock out this gun battery here. The crew is killed, and Schwab was written up for an award for it just for that brazen action. And that's one of many D-Day valor stories that you could tell. Like I said earlier about Harrison Summers and his action, to Ben Schwab, to other members of the 101st and what they did on D-Day. And this is another photograph series. Joe Pistone is on the left here, holding an M1 carbine, and we can see the gun that they've taken and knocked out here. You can see, once again, more of the equipment there. And then the next photograph is going to show some of the men that Schwab killed in his lone man assault into this gun battery position.
It's brutal.
It is. And you get a really good view into like the hedgerow, the denseness of it. The hedgerows in Normandy, they were there for hundreds of thousands of years. The hedgerows were used to separate farmland into who owned what. And so some of them with holes, you could literally crawl through them, but you can't go over them. They're too tall. Eventually, we bring in dozer tanks, and we had fit unique attachments to the front of them to allow them to literally plow through this vegetation. But the hedgerows on D-Day and even throughout Normandy literally determined life and death. You could be on one hedgerow and the Germans be in the next one, and you're separated by 75 to 100 meters. And due to the thickness of it, you don't know that they're there until your patrols perhaps run into each other, or your patrols pass each other in the darkness, and you don't even know it. They were perfect places for MG positions, for marksmen, to set up all sorts of ambush points and create all sorts of absolute hell and chaos. And due to the closeness of it, it's why I said earlier, the Thompson submachine gun becomes a very favorite weapon to be utilized in this close quarter fighting.
These farm field fights, right? So, like, how could one guy knock out 8? But if we've just paying attention to all that combat footage that has come out of Ukraine, all it matters is if you get the drop on somebody. And as much as people like to rag on video games, like if you play a tactical shooter, you can easily come up on some guys not paying attention. It's just kind of an interesting thing where, you hear like, how do you take on 8 guys? Like, well, if you're at the right place, right angle, right, and they don't see you coming, there's nothing you can do, right? But it's over before you have a chance.
The amount of, like I said, sources that are made available from guys just willing to talk about the realities of combat. You take the right flank through a hedgerow around this one farm field, and perhaps the Germans that are there aren't paying attention. They don't have the flank. This might be their first taste of combat, because for a lot of the German troops in Normandy, this was their first taste of combat. And so their flanks aren't secured, and you've taken the right angle. And you have the drop on them. Like you said, it's the right place, right time. It's the luck for it. Or in the example of Ben Schaub, it stunned them. A lot of these crazier actions that we hear, Schaub being one of them, various assaults that do take place in Normandy, it stunned the enemy and the Germans to see somebody just so blatantly stand up with disregard for their own life and not being able to react to that overall shock of seeing this figure that's just taking the time and working their way to you. Or even, it's the field of view effect. We only see combat through what we see here. If somebody's over here to my flank and I've got a machine gun that's pinning me down, or I've got a rifleman I'm engaging with, my field of view, my attention is directed right here. And that's one of the things about having your flank secured, is one of the utmost important aspects of combat, as you were even taught in the Marine Corps. But it's the chaos of having so many guys dropped everywhere, and the beauty, like I mentioned earlier, the chaos of the misdrop works in the favor of the paratroopers, because the Germans are going to have reports that the Americans were landing as far as Cherbourg and all the way behind Omaha Beach, not even all the way behind Omaha Beach, that German reinforcements are going to be so scattered about. And as the German troops are moving behind the Utah Beach area, you go through one farm field and it's fine. There's nobody there. You go through the next one and you just stumble across bodies of American and Germans. To the next field you come across, you're ambushed yourself, because there's just Americans everywhere.
And I know we've talked about this, or you talked about this, but late war Germany, this is a static division that's defending it. So everyone thinks, oh, it's the SS. Everyone's always fighting the SS. It's like, no, you're probably fighting whoever they can put together. And if these guys are, they're your reserve, well, not reserve, but your more rear guard troops, they're artillery crews, they're supply guys, they're logistics guys. They're not, they're probably trained up to some base level standard. It's a professional military, and then you're going up against these highly motivated, all volunteer guys that have been gunning for this. They got the drop on you. They got that surprise on you. They're all younger men, early volunteers. It's just going to pay off dividends. So it kind of just makes more sense because you hear all these crazy stories of like one guy rushes in. You're like, yeah, it kind of does make sense though, right? So interesting perspective.
Well, outside of like truly crack combat troops, because you do have some veterans, most certainly within the Osttroop and within the Germans stationed around Sainte-Marie-Église, Sainte-Marie-du-Mont, but the 6th Fallschirmjäger, headquartered at Saint-Côme-du-Mont, is definitely going to run head-to-head into the 501st and 3506 that far down south. And that is a very interesting fight to analyze of paratrooper versus paratrooper. And then eventually, the SS does get involved on 13 June with the counterattack to retake Carentan by the 17th SS there. But you're right. This is static divisions to eventually to where you are fighting Ost battalions to you're going up against German Fallschirmjäger that was considered to be a respectful fight there, and how you viewed each other. My dog got his chicken, so.
No, it's just, this is always interesting to know. And then, carry on.
And then we've got, photograph of American paratroopers rallying on D-Day in Sainte-Marie-du-Mont. And Sainte-Marie-du-Mont is one of my favorite villages to go to when I do get to Normandy, just because this is 101st territory on D-Day and beyond. The church itself is beautiful and magnificent, but inside there's a confession box, and the confession box has 3 or 4, 5 or 6 bullet holes in the confession box still. And according to the stories in the legend, especially with Mark Bando and what has been passed down, some German troops were caught hiding in the confession box on D-Day, and some paratroopers of the 101st fired away at the confession box.
Is nothing sacred?
No. And this is a reality of a hedgerow foxhole. We see how dense these hedgerows are, the camouflage and the cover that they can provide, and the challenges of navigating hedgerow country. all elements of the Allied forces in Normandy are going to see the realities of hedgerow country, especially for tank crews coming along. These hedgerows are perfect for anti-tank guns to be hidden, anti-tank weapons that are being carried by infantry and their anti-tank teams to hide and set up the perfect ambush. And so the hedgerow country for these untested combat divisions is a hard learning curve for the realities of what they have to deal with. You can also see the condom in that last photograph.
Yeah, I was gonna say you always sneak something in. And we have our M1A1 carbine, which it's more iconic, so they have at least 2 more condoms. But he has one over his barrel, and it's the paratrooper carbine. So like, what gets more paratrooper than that? Liberated
exactly.
I remember from our Iwo Jima one, you kind of slid stuff in, so I enjoy that.
I do what I can. And so quick statistics here, and then, I'll let you ask questions if you've got them, Luke. I can talk about some more of the combat stories if you want to hear them. You tell me, my man. But this is statistics that I've done for the company that I represent in Normandy. And for those of you interested in Company C and learning of the 502nd, and once again, no shade thrown to Band of Brothers, they put the 101st and Airborne Studies on the map, but there are so many units out there that are incredibly unique. But there's a surviving memoir that you can find on Kindle that is written by a member of Charlie Company of the 502nd. Unfortunately, he passed away before the memoir was officially published, but he wrote the majority of it. And it is called The Last First Sergeant here by Leighton Black. I'll pull that up later. And he details an excellent experience of his time in the paratroopers, Normandy, what it was like for him, and the Carentan Causeway, and a very small fight that his unit takes place in. It's a fight for the Cabbage Patch, which is, if you've ever seen maps of the charge down Purple Heart Lane and the move down Purple Heart Lane before Lieutenant Colonel Robert Cole led a mixed bag of 502nders, mainly 3502, to charge the Ingu farm that earned him his Medal of Honor. The 1st Battalion of the 502nd, with C Company leading the way, comes up behind them and moves into an area known as the Cabbage Patch, where they fight a small personal war against German Fallschirmjäger in a cabbage patch. And literally, Black talks about cabbage exploding near them as bullets hit it, as shrapnel hits this, and they're engaging these Germans at incredibly close range, fighting and dying in a cabbage patch, while members of 3502 are fighting and dying at Ingu Farm, and you've got mortars and artillery being brought down from the Fallschirmjäger as they're retreating back into Carentan, and the true chaos of the lead into Carentan. But for Charlie Company, out of the approximately 140 troopers that made up the company, and by the time they were pulled off the line on the 29th of June, they had suffered 18 killed in action, 56 wounded in action, and 6 were missing in action. That's a total casualty rate of 57% for Normandy alone. That's over 1 out of every 2 men. So for what I represent, had I been in Normandy in the role that I take on, I would have known these men killed or those wounded and maimed had I come through unscathed. And that itself is going to stay with me, whether I jump into Market Garden, make it through the Battle of the Bulge, fight through Germany and come home. The 50 Deuce alone are going to suffer over 800 casualties in their short stay in Normandy alone. And the fighting on June 6th is very important for historians and today, most certainly. But for the 50 Deuce, in my opinion, some of their more prominent fame and their hardest fights are going to happen in the days that follows leading into Carentan and after Carentan, especially the charge across the Carentan Causeway. We're looking at 4 bridges less than a mile long in a straight line where the enemy has the high ground. They've got scattered Fallschirmjäger in this swampy marshland picking shots at you. You have German anti-tank gun, an 88 that was stationed up on the hill there, as reported at least, that could fire down onto the causeway. And you have to cross this open terrain with no cover. You can't swim the causeway. We weigh too much. We can't just take rubber boats or wooden boats and cross the flooded marshlands for sitting ducks. There is no other way to get to Carentan from where we are due to how the Germans did flood the fields, except across this causeway. And the 502nd will dub it Purple Heart Lane due to the amount of casualties that they take just crossing this one piece of real estate that they pay for in blood.
Yeah. Well, I want to transition. I want to talk about two things: Brothers in Arms and Band of Brothers. We'll start with Brothers in Arms, just to keep it to the 502nd. So, how does Brothers in Arms do? Come on, load for me. How does Brothers in Arms do for actually? Oh, no, it's not going to let me share my picture. How does Brothers in Arms do for representing the 502nd? For those of you that don't know, Brothers in Arms was the greatest World War II shooter that ever came out in 2005, Road to Hill 30. And you basically play through the squad leader's perspective of being a squad leader as a paratrooper. You start with like one or two guys in your squad, and then you end the fight with different characters and stuff like that. I guess it's reversed, right? Because you start at the Bloody Gulch and then you end at the Bloody Gulch. Sorry, I ruined a game that came out 20 years ago.
But, in my opinion, for historical sake, outside of just because the unit's called, like, I think it's Fox Company, 3rd Battalion, 502nd. Outside of that, I would give it a 10 out of 10. What I loved about the game is not the actual play in the game, but the history and passion that was put into it. When you finished a mission, you could go into the game itself, done by Gearbox, and you could read the actual historical accounts of what happened for that level of the game. This is where I first read about and learned who Staff Sergeant Harrison Summers was and what he did on D-Day. And then I actually bought the books that included him and learned of his actions. This is where I learned about Lieutenant Colonel Robert Cole and the actions that he did in Normandy on D-Day, beyond, and eventually, of course, earning his Medal of Honor. But the team that designed that game went to ground and took photographs and did their research to make this as realistic as possible, to honor the men of the 5-0 Deuce. And in my opinion, no other game has ever come close to bringing that much history to life, and to give you a real understanding of your decisions have an impact. When you played that game, if you were attacking this village and you had your base of fire and you had your assault element, and if one of your members of the assault element was killed, they did not appear in the next level. There were consequences for your actions, which really put the weight on being an NCO or an officer. Now that I'm an adult and have played through that again, that the actions that you decide, the decisions and the orders you give your men, that weighs on the real life men who fought in Normandy, let alone every war that we've ever been a part of and anyone's ever been a part of. And that was a real life struggle that you knew that you very well could lose men in this assault. And that was something that you had to live with, that those decisions you were going to make there. But it also showed the ugliness of the brutality of war, how senseless war could be. The deaths of Allen and Garnett, we eventually learn about that in the game. Realistically, just how easy death was able to find people in Normandy versus how others seem to be untouchable. But in terms of real life, that's Lieutenant Colonel Robert Cole. He was untouchable in Normandy. His men described him as having a death wish or being the luckiest son of a bitch to live. And that's how he led and fought. He's killed, if memory serves me correctly, on D+3 in Operation Market Garden. In Holland. He's shot by a sniper and killed. This man that was so untouchable and of myth and fame in Normandy snuffed out in the next operation. And that's a reality for a lot of these Normandy veterans that do come out unscathed. They, in the next operation, are wounded themselves or unfortunately get killed or killed later on in the Battle of the Bulge. But Brothers in Arms if you ever want to see and learn about small unit tactics from the 502nd, I can't recommend it enough. Well, yes, it is a video game. The historical love and passion that went into that are beyond any other game that I have ever seen since its time.
And I just want to build off that because they showed pictures of, they would show you a picture of the battle or the street and the house, and then they would show you it in the video game. So you're like, oh, I'm actually fighting down that.
Yep.
And you're talking about the gameplay. When you're actually pulling that rifle up to your shoulder like an M1 Garand, your sights are moving all over the place. You might have somebody lined up, but that round's not hitting. And like when I was a kid, I'm like, what the hell? Like, come on, this is like Call of Duty. Like, why can't I hit? And then as you know, making a channel that's regarded to shooting and like having a lot of shooting experience, like, no, that is actually how it would go. Like, you don't just bring up and you're cool, calm, collected. The breathing doesn't impact. If you're pushing 50 yards here, 50 yards there, running 100 meters, we saw this all the time in training. Like, you can't hit anything, dude. Like, it is just impossible to like accurately put rounds on target. And I feel like that game captures like physical stress, anxiety by just making things just not hit where you're aiming. So like, I love that about it. But man, you're making me want to play like Brothers in Arms. You're making me want to play Steel Division. You're making me want to play Gates of Hell. I need to, so much time. All right. So I don't want to take too much of your time. I have a French musket to unwrap here, but I do want to talk about some of the we'll start with misconceptions, right? So what are the misconceptions, or what does Band of Brothers get wrong? The caveat being, obviously, Band of Brothers is like the greatest war series to come out in the last half century, if ever. So Band of Brothers, it's at the peak. No one's questioning it, but it has to get some things wrong, right?
Right. So first things first, Easy Company, 506 did not win the war single-handedly. They do their part, but so does every other element of the 101st. The 82nd, the British 6th Airborne Division, regular infantry units. And I always tell people this, and it's actually what I got from Mark Bando. Had Stephen Ambrose chose any other unit, whether it was in the 101st, the 82nd, or even a standard infantry unit, that group of men would have been the Band of Brothers that we know today. It could have been F502. It could have been E501. It could have been, Company A of the 116th Infantry Regiment. That would have been the Band of Brothers that we see today. So always keep that in the forefront of the mind. But Band of Brothers does get a lot of things right. Terminology in many ways for the vocabulary that's used. And it's really interesting. I would love to do a Band of Brothers in the Pacific breakdown with you one day on a show that's made before 9/11 versus a show after 9/11. But for the D-Day episode alone, the first contact in Band of Brothers that we see is Lieutenant Winters, who is weaponless, and his ragtag group of men from E506 and two 82nd Airborne paratroopers that they have gathered consist of Joe Toy, Bill Garnier, Popeye Wynn, if memory serves me correctly, and Carwood Lipton. And so they set up this ambush of this German horse cart that's being drawn unsuspectingly. And Bill Garnier opens up fire first, and we see that. In actuality, Lieutenant Winters and his group did not do that. They were a part of a column that was attached to Lieutenant Colonel Robert Cole. Cole had met up with Winters, I believe, along the D914, and added to his ever-growing group of well over 100 troopers. So the lead column, which was members of the 502nd, Dick Ladd, that I mentioned earlier, was a part of the ambush, is actually going to set this ambush of the German horse-drawn cart. So Easy Company at this point that's gathered with Cole is in the middle of the column. The front of the column creates the ambush. The Easy guys most certainly hear it. As they pass this, Bill Garnier does shoot the German horses that are already wounded, dead, or dying, saying, he shot them because they were German. But that is one thing that was taken out of historical context and used for artistic interpretation of what some of the combat that night was like, is that the Winters group did not set that ambush. The Winters group eventually does break off, though, and then they will eventually begin to assault and gather troops for their Break Corps Manor assault. But some other things about the D-Day episode that I can just think of off the top of my head is that there was a member of Fox, a few members of Fox Company 506 participate in the Bray Corps Manor assault. It wasn't just an easy company affair. For example, when we get to it, if you've seen the Bray Corps Manor assault, Bill Garnier is most famously quoted in that little scene of looking at Gerald Lorraine, who was Sink's Jeep driver, and saying, fucking Jeep jockey, after Lorraine misses these shots on these Germans fleeing the trenches, and we see Bill Garnier gun them down with a Thompson. In actuality, it was Bill Garnier who missed the fleeing Germans, and Gerald Lorraine is the one that gunned them down. And Lorraine is actually awarded a Silver Star for his actions at Bray Corps Manor. You have a hodgepodge of troopers that are involved there in the action, and it's like in the show, John Hall, who was a radio operator with Able 506, and gets killed in action there. Well, it actually wasn't a part of Able 506. It was John Hall's of Dog 506, if memory serves me correctly, that was killed in action in that assault there. But the assault, for the most part, is accurate. I would give it to 90% to actually how it happened and played out there. But when you see Buck Compton and Don Malarkey and Joe Toy making their assault and making hand signals to toss their grenades, those hand signals actually aren't from World War II. That is much later, Vietnam era and beyond, that were utilized there. And just due to, perhaps some historians not doing the proper research and things of that nature. But for the most part, since we're only talking about D-Day, for the most part, the D-Day episode is a fantastic episode that does show the chaos of the drop. You see the casualties, the wounded that have gathered. You see the dead paratroopers at some point in the trees, which was a reality of Normandy. A lot of those guys hung there for days, if not weeks, because, as a trooper that's moving on the ground, let's say I recognize some guys from my company, or even my stick, that were caught in the trees, shot and killed by the Germans. Because, the Germans knew that if they got down to the ground, they're going to get their weapons and kill them. It's a part of the war. I can't just climb a tree and cut these guys out of the tree. I've got a job to do. I have to go fight. I have to follow the orders given to me. Graves registration will take care of that. And the Graves registration, troopers and soldiers in Normandy, they had probably one of the worst tasks, realistically, of recovering the dead, identifying the dead, and burying the dead, all across, and trying to find the dead. You've got thousands of people that are missing and dead there. But as Band of Brothers goes on, we could talk more about it another time. Most certainly, I would give Band of Brothers overall an 8.5 out of 10 on what they get right versus what they get wrong. But that's just being nitpicky. They do set the standard. But I do hope that folks see this, take more information from this, and want to learn about the 502nd, learn more about the other battalions of the 506 or the 501st, and their fight at the La Barquette Locks there.
That is a brutal rating, 8.5 out of 10. I don't even know. I give all we have in the Revolutionary War era is the Patriot, and I give the Patriot a 6 out of 10. It's just a fun movie.
It's a fun movie.
Yeah, I did. It's a fun. Oh, I'll absolutely bring you back on because I want to talk about Band of Brothers. I want to talk about the Pacific, and that is interesting because Band of Brothers drops the weekend before 9/11 or the weekend after. And so, for me, just for me and a lot of the generation, our generation, 9/11 happens, Band of Brothers happens. Band of Brothers starts off talking about Pearl Harbor, we was attacked, right? And then as a kid, 9/11, we was attacked. It's This is our generation's Pearl Harbor moment. And then Band of Brothers, World War II, that generation is just passing on. They're in their late 70s, early 80s. It's the height of World War II in media, to the point where there's a reason for the last 10 years or 15 years, really, they haven't touched World War II. It's just they overdid it. But I would love to have. I mean, there's still World War II stuff, but you know how it was, early 2000s, mid 2000s. Yep. It was the highlight. It was its height. And I guess I want to hear your opinion on, well, one, this is the Bray Corps Manor assault. I didn't realize the guns were all in the line. I thought there was like an L. So I guess the machine gun position is back to the left to provide flank cover or something. So I could see how they could run down that line really quick. But I'll have to look into that battle a little bit more. But the question I have for you is, go ahead.
You go ahead.
Oh, okay. No, I'll let you talk on that battle, and then I want to hear your perspective, because we have to remember that when Band of Brothers is written, it is basically a lot of the survivors, the Toccoa men that were the staff NCOs that had maintained a friendship over the years that went to the reunions. So you're getting the perspective of those guys. And some of the stuff was before the internet, before Facebook, before ways of like keeping in touch. Everybody knows like the famous one is Albert Blythe, right? He doesn't die in Normandy. Like he goes on and fights in Korea. There's like a lot of which is fair. Like that's, how does one know? Right. But, I'm just kind of interesting, like Stephen Ambrose, right? He's writing from such it's not wrong. It's just an interesting perspective to see that it's such a small group of men that are so tight knit. And that's why I wonder what your perspective is on that. And if you wonder why they kind of like blame some of the people. Yeah, I don't know. I don't want you to get canceled for going after Band of Brothers.
I won't get canceled.
An interesting perspective.
Well, and if I do get canceled, so be it. But you're right, though. A lot of the direction and attitudes of some people in that show are written off this cadre that got close to Ambrose or was put into contact with Ambrose. For example, Captain Sobel in the show, by many of the men, was hated well before they went into combat. However, if you read, for example, Don Malarkey's account, and if you read some of the other accounts and listen to what the men have to say, they credited him in many ways with a lot of their survival just because of the toughness that he grilled them with. And Sobel was no coward. Sobel on D-Day is going to jump into combat. I believe he was attached to the regimental HQ at the 506. If memory serves me correct on that, but he jumps into combat on D-Day, assaults a German machine gun nest by himself, grenades it, kills the crew, and is awarded a Bronze Star. Far from a coward. And, after the war, Captain Sobel was invited to some of the reunions by the E506 guys, doesn't appear. Unfortunately, attempted to take his own life, and that failed. And just kind of lived out a sad few rest of the years of his life. But a lot of that animosity was taken from the officer's perspective. For example, although Winters is seen as a great American hero, and his actions and his leadership most certainly do that, Winters did not like Sobel. And that was definitely taken firsthand and put into Band of Brothers by Ambrose in the book. And other members did, versus Don Malarkey, however, on the other hand, viewed it a totally different way. You've got, for example, Cobb, who is wounded in the plane. And he was wounded before they jumped. And in the show is just kind of seen as this aggressive and mean and kind of a bitter man. His family had complaints and issues about that, saying that's not the guy that we knew. He wasn't like that. He was sweet and endearing and kind. So it's really interesting to see the influence that some of the more notable figures of the show do have on Ambrose. And that's where I always tell people, when you do read these memoirs, you can't just read Winters' memoir. If you want to do a deep dive, you've got to read everybody's memoir. You have to look at their interviews because human memory is flawed. Certain men will remember D-Day. And even though that might have been side by side, their experience is totally different just because of how they saw the war through their own eyes. However, due to personal preferences and personal biases, it's important to understand how some people did not like certain members they served with and others did. It's the uniqueness of humans, just being humans, and us liking one another as characters versus things that we dislike each other about. It would have been really unique had Ambrose done a proper, and I say proper just because I'm not a fan of how Ambrose does approach a lot of his work, a proper dive with all the members that possibly could have served with Easy Company and gotten their opinions. there's a great book that I have to recommend to people that I'm going to grab real quick. It's right here. That is a companion to Band of Brothers that I believe is better by leaps, leagues, and bounds. And it is called Fighting Fox Company. It is written by Terry Poser and Bill Brown, and it is about Fox Company 506 during World War II. And they reached out and got a hold with as many veterans as they could and their families to tell a proper story of all the men involved with Fox Company that they could. It is a phenomenal, phenomenal research and effort that I highly, highly recommend to anyone interested in paratrooper studies.
Yeah, I just want to build off that real quick. Great summary. The oh, is this gonna go full screen? Come on, do my full screen. Full screen. Cobb, you need a guy like Cobb. And for those that don't remember the scene in the show, after D-Day, after Normandy, before they jump into Holland, the new guys show up, and they're wearing what Cobb is wearing right here on his left chest, that purple presidential unit citation. So the president gives the unit a citation. I think it's to the regiment.
Correct.
And the new guys are wearing it, right, for action done on Normandy. And Cobb rightly points out, hey, man, like, you weren't there. Like, you can't wear a regimental, thing. And then was a sergeant, the big sergeant, I can't remember his name.
Bull Randleman
Comes over. Bull Randleman comes over, and because the new guys take off the presidential unit citation, they put it on the bar table, and they walk off. Bull Randleman comes up, and he's just like, shit, Cobb, you weren't there either. And Cobb's like, well, I got shot in the plane. But, like, you need somebody like Cobb to kind of knock the new guys down, right? Like, you're not coming into this organization as an equal. You're subservient to leadership. So my opinions have changed on Cobb. And then what was the other part I want to talk about? Yeah, well, we could come back. We'll do a whole thing on Band of Brothers. I'll do Band of Brothers over the Pacific. The Pacific sucks. I didn't enjoy it at all. It's just Marines. It makes the Marine Corps. It just makes the Marine Corps look so awful. They just look so like. They bitch, moan, and complain. It's just like, all right, yeah, but like they're professional fighters, and I wonder if that kind of ties into the post 9/11. Oh, Dick Winters. I'll close with this, and then I'll let you close. But there was a really good podcast on the 20 years after Band of Brothers came out, and it covered every episode by episode every week. Highly recommended it. HBO puts it out. And what was great about that is that you get to find out that Dick Winters he's no joke. Like in the show, he comes off as very like soft, like caring, all this sort of stuff. And they're like, no, Dick Winters like ran a tight ship. Like he was not the kind of guy you mess around with. They talked about like when they first shot the scene from D-Day, Dick Winters is like, they show him the scene. He's like, all right, this is you on D-Day, like looking lost. And he's like, I would never have been lost. I knew what I was doing. Like he was like that kind of, he was a professional soldier. So like, yeah, I could see how you have a company commander. I think he's battalion XO at the end of the war, and he could butt heads with Captain Sobel. And that's just like how officers are. If you're leading, to be in an elite organization like the paratroopers, and then to be a leader of a whole company of paratroopers, you got to have confidence. You got to have drive. You're a competitive person by default. Like you can't not be competitive. And when you have so many competitive people, especially in the officer class, like it happens to this day. Like officers still they have their own internal politics. So that's all I'll let you close out, Zach. Yeah.
I'll leave us with a quote here that I should have brought into the combat portion of my talk today, and I didn't. And for those of you out there that perhaps want more of a combat testimony of the 502nd, I'll happily do that for you guys. But this comes from Avenging Eagles, and this is a quote from Stash Bernowski, who was with Headquarters Company, 1st Battalion 506. And I'll leave you with this to ponder about the realities of D-Day and Normandy and the Second World War in general and beyond and before. Imagine being an 18-year-old kid. They train you to kill, then load you down with weapons and drop you into enemy territory. They've drilled into you, God. You are God. You have the power of life and death over anyone who gets in your way.
Yeah, that's intense. Well, thank you so much, Zach. Mr. Wood, thank you for coming on. I'll have you on again. It's always good because you come so prepared and makes this really easy. I always enjoy our conversations. You got to go off and do some realism. I have to go unbox a French Marine musket, and we'll do another one this fall. Or any other time. I think I have you on for 5th Marine Division. We'll do a special sometime soon. All right, guys. Thank you so much, Zach. Again, take this day. I know I'm pretty amped up about it because I love history, but yeah, it's a somber, serious day. Obviously, it's an anniversary of one of the important pieces of American history. And until next time.
Thanks, my friend. Take care now.